Our next speaker, Mr. Rupert Younger, as I mentioned, is a professor at Oxford University. He's a frequent commentator on reputation issues in the media. And I actually invited him to come speak because I've had the privilege to take one of his courses where he really helped crystallize already existing notions in my mind on how you frame reputation. What is reputation? Do you own it? Who owns reputation? What is brand? What is identity? And I figured he was really the perfect speaker to come and speak to this communications team to understand how the function is evolving and why reputation is becoming more and more important. And he's going to also walk you guys through some interesting case studies, some that are really relevant, that are happening as we speak, others that happened a few years ago, just to show you what happens in these type of situations and the impact they can have on organizations, especially publicly traded organizations. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Mr. Rupert Younger.
Thank you, Omar, and it's a real pleasure to be here in the heat. Although this room is probably the coldest I've ever been. So it's a world of two halves out here. So I'm going to start with context, the question of context. If you take a look at what you put on your own website, if you have a look at what's written about you in local media, it's very easy to think that this is an organization with nothing but unalloyed, positive, good news. And that's, of course, at least in part, wholly true. I've had the great pleasure of looking through a number of bits of communications activity that you have put out, and it's extremely interesting what this business is doing. It's a strategic business, it's incredibly important to the region, and you're working to try and improve the lives of very many people. But the context in which you operate is changing. And it's important when we think about the question of reputation and the question of the corporate affairs and communications activity that we start there. The global context, first of all. We've had, in the last 10 years, an unprecedented crisis of trust in business. Business around the world has let people down, led, of course, by the finance industry, post the financial crash in 2007, 2008. But if you go back further than the last 10 years, the observation that I'd start with is that business has had a very fragile relationship with the societies that it sits among for very many years, arguably thousands of years. Now, what do I mean by that? It's the point that I'm trying to make is that business is given a license by the societies in which it sits. And that business license is extremely valuable. Businesses are allowed to contract. They have tax advantages. They can hire. They can make contracts. There's a whole range of things that businesses are allowed to do by the societies in which they're based. Now, with that comes a responsibility to behave well. And that relationship about business and society, which we're going to come on to in terms of the current themes, has a very long history of being fragile. If you go back 2,000 years, the Phoenician traders were a very, very suspect group of people. They were very powerful, but they had questionable CSR policies. Okay? If we go back to the finance houses of the Middle Ages, this is the middle picture, of course, is Shylock's Merchant of Venice. So Shakespeare's famous character. And in the Middle Ages, the finance institutions were the troubled institutions. They were a group of people who no one really wanted to be part of. And if you come back to just today's story, you're seeing an increasing growing movement of antipathy and sometimes outright hostility towards business. And in particular, the greed, corruption, and sometimes excessive pay that comes with business. So it's been a fragile relationship for a number of years. The second contextual point is that business is being asked to do a lot more today. Government spending around the world is cutting back in some of the key areas that governments have traditionally always been responsible for. This shows the percentage of federal spend in the US, and federal spending in the second quarter of last year in the US fell to below 1.4% of GDP for the first time since the 1940s. So governments around the world are withdrawing their spending, and business is increasingly expected to fill the gap. Business is expected to now take up and do some of the things that government historically has been asked to do. The third context is this, I think safely we can say that we've reached the end of the shareholder value period. Shareholder value has been the dominant leadership theory since 1970, since that very famous Milton Friedman academic paper, which was published in 1970, that said the only responsibility of managers is to produce profits. And profits will then go to the owners, who will then decide what to do with that profit. Now, that's been the dominant leadership theory for the last 50-odd years. But we're now approaching the changing world and the end of that dominant theory. In 2014, the UK changed its laws to make directors of companies responsible for more than just shareholders for the first time. Directors are now in the UK responsible for stakeholders as well as shareholders. And that means employees, suppliers, customers, and that's a legal responsibility. In the US, you have got Senator Elizabeth Warren, one of the presidential candidates maybe next time round, who is introducing the Accountable Capitalism Act. And the growth in the Benefit Corp, the B Corp movement in the States, is another example of this multi-stakeholder environment. In France, President Macron has announced and is championing the French equivalent of B Corps, which are called Sociétés à Mission. So around the world, this idea that shareholder value is the only real objective of business is being deconstructed. And increasingly now, managers and businesses are expected to look after multiple audiences. Now, that's a very difficult thing to do well, because the right questions are which audience, who do you prioritize, when, how much. All of these are much more difficult questions than the world of the last 50 years, which was very simple. Produce profits, and that's your only set of responsibilities. Within that, the sector is facing a huge number of questions. The oil and gas sector. This, of course, is BP's head office in London. I was there 2 weeks ago when this happened. This was just on the week of their AGM, when a campaigning group, Greenpeace, bolted 2 Perspex cubicles to the ground outside BP's head office, blocking the access to their front door. They lowered it throughout the night, from 2 in the morning till 6 in the morning, and then drilled bolts into the pavement. And in each of those 2 Perspex boxes were 7 climate activists who had enough food for a week, sanitary, the sanitary equipment, everything to last without being interrupted for a week. They were eventually bolt-cutted out by the police 36 hours later. Okay? This is a world where increasingly the sector is becoming a pariah sector. This question of oil and gas and the responsibilities of oil and gas companies in a world where climate change and the environment is taking top slot. Within that context as well, you've got the voice of investors. So this was Larry Fink, the head of Blackrock, the world's largest investor. And he came out in his annual letter just over a year ago, making the point that actually, as BlackRock, as a major investor, they were now expecting companies to produce more than just financial returns. They had to demonstrate a societal value. So the world around you, the world in which you're operating as ADNOC, is changing fundamentally. And the big question is really what type of reputations and what type of communication and reputation strategies are going to be fit for purpose in this new emerging world. So, I'm going to just give you then a couple of other contextual things to anchor this debate, because, again, there are some other factors outside of the investor world and the energy world, and that question is the question of trust. The first big issue that I want to raise is that trust is now a very different world, the world of trust, than it was maybe 20 years ago. Around the world, historically, trust has been hierarchical and vertical. You were trusted if you were the governor of the Bank of England. You were trusted if you were the chief executive of a company. You were trusted if you were the leader of a nation, because you'd earned the right to trust by being senior and expert at what you did. That world is now changing dramatically. This work from Rachel Botsman, a colleague of mine at Oxford, argues that actually trust is now not vertical. Trust is horizontal. And what she means by this is the world, for example, of TripAdvisor. If you are on TripAdvisor, and if I am an owner of a restaurant on TripAdvisor, and I post pictures of my restaurant and all the information that I think is relevant, but someone else posts a negative post, people are more likely, 8 out of 10 people are more likely to believe the negative post from the other user than they are from me. So the world of peer-to-peer review is changing the nature of trust. And you've seen this all around the world. Politicians are not trusted. Business leaders are no longer trusted. We've seen Mark Carney at the Bank of England. The Bank of England was arguably one of the most trusted people in England, and they are now, there's undoubtedly a deficit of trust happening there. So the world of trust is changing. You've also got changing norms. The world is moving much more towards collaborative economies. Now, this is a world, actually, where you are very fit for purpose as ADNOC. You are doing collaborative deals across the world with a number of very interesting companies. So in this area, I think you are extremely well placed to benefit from one of the most interesting business trends, the emergence of collaborative economies. And the final changing norm or backdrop that I want to raise is what I talk about in the book, which I published about 18 months ago, 2 years ago. By the way, there are copies of that outside, which you can all take away after today. But the theme of that was that we now live in a world of hyperconnectivity. Information moves super fast and with super certainty. And that's a world where communications, for a start, becomes much more difficult. But it's a world where reputations are fought over, created, destroyed, and rebuilt in fundamentally different ways. So these are some of the contextual backdrops that I want to then anchor the conversation today on the question of reputation formation and destruction. To anchor why it's important, has anyone here seen this? This is China's social credit score. Hands up if anyone here has come across this concept of China's social credit score. So a handful, one or two people in the room. It's an incredibly interesting thing. I spend my time stuck away in books and doing research, and one of the things that I found in late 2014 in the footnotes of the Chinese Central Communist Party's annual proceedings was a little note, a footnote that said that by 2020, every single one of China's 1.2 billion citizens would have a social credit score. Now, I know what a credit score is, as all of you will, but I wasn't sure what a social credit score was. Turns out that the social credit score that China is putting in place by next year is going to have 5 things. 2 of them are going to be completely normal, which is your financials and your demographics. But 3 of them, 3 factors, are reputational. The first is going to be what I would call your friendship quotient. So if this gentleman here posts a negative post about the Chinese economy, he obviously gets a bad rating from the Chinese authorities. But if he and I are connected on social media, my simple connection with him means that I also get a negative rating because I'm connected to him. Now, this, of course, feels a little Orwellian to those of us from the West, but actually, it's a very interesting idea because the Chinese, of course, see this as pro-social. This is a way of helping positive circles of behavior and influence start to generate. The second reputational thing is fulfillment criteria. And that is this both in enterprises, businesses, as well as individuals. If you make commitments as a director of a company on environment or anything else and fail to meet them, you'll get a negative rating in your social credit score. And also, if you fail to turn up on time for meetings or you have other sort of attributes like that, you will also be derated. And the final element is whether you're seen to be a productive member of society. If I'm a gamer in my room and just sitting there in my room and never seeing anyone throughout the day, I will have a low rating, but if I'm a positive member of society, maybe a teacher, I will have a much more positive rating. All of these are going to come into one number, one score, and this is a reputation score for every single one of China's 1.2 billion citizens. That number is going to be between, we think, 350 and 950. At 600, you can apply for and be considered for a loan. At 650, you can apply and be considered for a visa to Singapore. At 700, you can apply and be considered for a fast-track access through Beijing International Airport. At 750, you can apply and be considered for a visa to the Schengen area in Europe. These scores are going to matter. If you're in the love business and you're trying to find a partner for life, your score will determine whether you appear first or last on China's equivalent of Tinder, which is called Baihei. If you have a score of 850 or 800, you'll appear pretty quickly. But if you're down at 350, 400, good luck in finding love. It ain't going to happen. So the reputation economy is here to stay. And the world of AI and algorithms, which is a world that we're studying a lot at Oxford now, is only going to increase the power of automated systems and reputational algorithms. So the power of reputation today is enormous, and it's set to become more important and a bigger determinant of your individual and your corporate success over the next 10, 15, 20 years. So, with that in mind, what is reputation, and what is it that you think you can do with it? Let's start with, and this is going to be a bit more interactive, so let's start with your views on what reputation is. Any thoughts? If you just shout out, don't worry about the microphones, just shout out anything that comes to mind in terms of what you think the definition of reputation is. Image. Okay, very good. So image, that's definitely one option. What else? Perception. And then? Very nice. This idea of word association as well. So perceptions, image, and word associations. This idea of immediate connections that you make. What else? Trust. Okay, so trust is in there. Good. What else? Your position. Okay, what do you mean by that? Appearance. Definitely true. 100% true. Okay, appearance. So just the visual. Okay? Power. And that maybe comes back to your point about position within the industry. So that's sort of maybe more of a status point as well. Okay. What else? Anything else? Name. Fame. Perfect. Yeah, of course. So that's visibility, perhaps. And fame is sometimes good and maybe sometimes not so good. Yeah? It depends on what you're being famous for, or indeed whether you're famous or infamous, perhaps. Okay. So, just a few questions then. Is it the same thing as your brand? Who thinks that reputation is the same thing as brand? Hands up. Same thing? Sort of some of you. Who thinks it's different? Hands up. Okay. So let's just explore this question. For those who said that it's the same thing as brand, one of you explain why you think that's the case. Yes? Okay, so if everyone heard that, it's how people view you, and that's therefore your reputation. Okay? Yeah. Okay, so your brand is linked to your reputation because it's the personification of you. Okay?
You say reputation is the image, so the brand is your image, so it's of course.
So there's some link, but it's not the same thing. Okay. So let's just explore and just deal with this first question. Brand and reputation are not the same thing. Let me give you the very clear, simple pathway to this. Give me some big brands with bad reputations. Volkswagen, Microsoft, Boeing, Nokia, and so on. Philip Morris, okay? Brands, you can have very, very big brands, very powerful big brands with not so great reputations. And also, especially in your industry, by the way, there's a number of businesses which have very, very little brand visibility at all, which have phenomenal reputations. Suppliers, parts suppliers, technical suppliers in your industry, and you would think very highly of them, but they don't have a brand per se. So the idea of brand and reputation, there's undoubtedly some links, but they are different, okay? The Catholic Church, you could argue, one of the best brands in the world, the Vatican, but probably not one of the greatest reputations right at the moment. Okay? So brand and reputation linked, but different. What about fact and gossip? If I was to pick on this gentleman here, what's your name? Saeed. Okay, so if I was to spend the next 20 minutes lying through my teeth about Saeed, could that form part of his reputation? It could, but of course, you know Saeed better than me. So it depends on who is going to be speaking about this. So it's localized. If Saeed happens to be one of your best friends in this particular group, and I start saying bad things about Saeed, you probably then start to think that I'm not so great. Okay? Exactly. So, but undoubtedly, truth doesn't necessarily matter. I can start to tell lies about something, and that can form a reputation. And one of the big problems in today's hyper-connected world is the question of fake news, which we've all heard about. Interestingly enough, we did a conference on this 9 years ago with the White House. And we called this concept fake news back then. And I'm only hoping that the White House hasn't decided that they'd use what we talked about then to justify the fake news epidemic that is emerging out of the US. So the idea of fact doesn't seem to be attached to reputation either. Okay? So let me anchor you then in this connection between brand, image, and identity and reputation. From the research, we start with identity, which, if you like, is your DNA. This can be your personal identity, but it can also be your corporate identity, your corporate DNA. And there's quite a lot that's been talked about already today, and I'm going to anchor some of that back from the work I've done looking at you in what the identity of ADNOC is. But you start with this concept that the identity is your DNA. If your branding people have done a really great job of capturing the true DNA of the organization, then your brand will reflect your identity. Okay? And your brand is what you want people to see you as. It's a projection. It's also something you have a lot more control over. Your brand can be a visual. It could be a logo. It could be a type of language that you use. So it could be warm and inclusive, or it could be formal and structured. Okay, your choice of language, how you speak about yourself, is a brand expression. So these are all things that are within your control. Reputation is what people actually see you as. Does this make sense? This distinction between identity at the core of your DNA, the projection of what you want to be seen as is your brand, and then there's what you're actually seen as, which is your reputation. Now, if you do a great job in the work that you do, your reputation will mirror and reflect and draw off your brand. And that's where you get this very powerful connection of authenticity. People have talked about this word authenticity a lot, but that's the connection. If you're authentic to your brand promise in your communications activity, then your reputation will be reflective of your brand. So, and I thought I'd give you this as well, just as a sort of anchor, which is to think about a definition and to separate it out from trust. Reputation is, now, as academics, we fight like ferrets in a sack about most things, but this is the closest that most people come to agreeing on a definition of reputation, which is expectations about an organization's future behavior or performance based on perceptions of past behaviors. So two critical words there, expectations and perceptions. Those two fundamental anchor points for reputation. Trust is different. Trust is a much higher order concept. It's a firm belief in something. It's an absolute. And so it differs in a number of really important ways to reputation. Now, we're not going to spend too much time talking about trust this morning, but we can answer that in any Q&A that we've got, because I want to focus the time on reputation and why it's valuable and how it connects to your jobs. So the next question, who owns it? Who owns your reputation? Any thoughts? Everybody else. Okay, everybody else? Who else? Everybody and nobody. Everyone in the organization. Okay, so that's everyone else, and you're saying actually we do. Everyone who you impact. Exactly. Okay, so that's a sort of combination of those two, isn't it? That's a sort of interaction between outside and inside. Who else? Yeah. The media. Okay. The community. Who else? The stakeholders. Anyone who's a stakeholder. So it could be employees, could be suppliers, could be regulators, could be governments. Yep, okay. They control it, we own it. Okay, interesting, okay. So, any of these people? All of them?
Well, again, there's a certain context, you know. So, on Twitter, the president of the USA may own the reputation of America, but others would say he may not represent all of the
Yep.
reputation of America. So, you know, it's in the eye of the beholder.
Okay, so there's a contextual point and eye of the beholder. So let me ask you a question. Who owns my reputation here today? We? You? Me? Both of us? All of us? No one. Okay, so we've got lots of answers here. Yes? So Google owns my reputation. Oh dear. Okay. Social credit score.
Your credit score. So the fact that you're associated with export, that gives you a higher credit score.
Yep.
So everything, all the stakeholders are part of the
Okay.
reputation now. It's not limited. Before maybe it was limited, but now with the social media and
Yep.
with the search enablement.
So let me ask you again. Who owns it? Now that I mean as being the ability to go away and talk about me in the way in which you want to talk about me. I am what you know. Yep. So, follow that through. Who owns my reputation? You. Everyone get that? No. In the corner. Okay, so your argument is that I own my own reputation, but I influence the perceptions of others. Okay.
You being here today,
Yep.
we know about you being taking part in the forum, so we might have Googled you or, you know, like did some sort of research. You would find things across different platforms.
So actually, I think the logical way of looking at that is to flip it 100%. Because what you're actually saying is right, but it's the other way around. I influence my reputation, but you own it. Yeah, that makes sense? Because I can influence it by turning up, number one. I can influence it by maybe optimizing my social media feeds and having lots of nice things appear on the Google search. I can influence it by asking Omar to introduce me in a certain way. I'm influencing it by the fact that I've chosen to work at the University of Oxford as opposed to some other lesser university. Okay? These are all influence mechanisms. But the ownership rests with you, which is you can walk away from this morning and go, what a phenomenal waste of time this morning was. Now, hopefully, you're not going to do that, and this is my influence that I'm hoping that you won't go away and do that. But the control is with you. You can decide whether you think I'm worth it or not. That's a reputational ownership. Now, this is important. It's super important because when you think about the work that you do, it's unlike any other corporate function. Other corporate functions, I want a marketing plan by Tuesday. I want a finance plan in operation by Friday. I want to run out a new advertising campaign over the month of July. They're all levers that are pulled, and you then run things through. But you can't say, I want a good reputation by Thursday. It just doesn't work like that. So it's a much more fragile thing. And it demands a really, really intelligent, high EQ form of engagement. And that's the power of your function. When I think about reputation in a corporate context, I see reputation as the oil in an engine. Think of that concept. An engine has lots of moving parts, but without some oil, it doesn't actually work. It doesn't work as well as perhaps it should do. The levers don't move as smoothly as they would. And that's because the reputation is not in place. What you do is you create the license to operate. The license to operate with politicians and political audiences. The license to operate with your suppliers. You create pricing advantage and visibility with customers. You create all of these things through creating reputation capital. Okay? So, the ownership sits outside. So the core concept one, I hope you're still with me at this point, is that you don't own your reputation. It's owned by others, but you can influence it but not control it. That sound okay? Okay. Right. Next concept. How many reputations do you have? One. I like it. One. Who else agrees? Infinite. So we've got one. Infinite. What else have we got? Depends. One, infinite, and depends.
So many actually. Depends on your audience, the background, the culture of the people in front of you.
Yes.
Reputation can be affected in this kind
Exactly. Exactly. So it just depends on who you're interacting with. So how many reputations do you have?
So many. Infinite.
An infinite number of different reputations. And it's a really important point. I've spent years working with the national newspaper editors, trying to win them around to this concept that when they talk about the reputation of BP after the BP crisis, Lionel Barber wrote this big piece, or he published this big piece, he's the editor of the FT, about saying the reputation of BP is destroyed. I rang him up. Lionel's a visiting fellow with us at Oxford. I rang him up and I said, Lionel, what on earth are you talking about? And he said, well, it's terrible, the reputation of BP. I said, but what reputation? Their reputation for deep water drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, undoubtedly, that's bad. But their reputation for large, easy oil projects, unaffected. 3 weeks after the spill in the Gulf of Mexico, you'll probably remember this, BP was awarded a new license in the Gulf of Sidra, together with Total, I think it was. And that was 3 weeks in, and all the newspapers all said, how on earth could this be possible? You're giving BP, when you see what's happening in the Gulf of Mexico, and you're giving them a new license? But they'd operated in the Gulf of Sidra for what? Well, I'll defer to my BP colleagues over there, but for 35, 40 years, maybe? They were a major financial partner with other operators. It was an entirely different set of reputations at stake. So it's actually a really important concept, this idea of multiple reputations, not singular. And it's incredibly liberating. It's also your game, because what you get to decide is which reputations matter, which are important and need to be harnessed, protected, and which reputations just don't matter. That's a strategic question, and you are the owners of that question inside this organization. And there are going to be some reputations that really do matter, but there are going to be other reputations that frankly don't matter at all. And that's a very liberating concept. So, the second concept is that you have multiple reputations for certain things with different audiences. Decide what you want to be known for and with whom. Does that sound like a sensible second concept? And it probably chimes and connects with what you spend quite a lot of your day doing. When you're thinking about a press release on the partnerships that you've put in place on refining with any. You're talking about a reputation for collaboration, a reputation for building high-impact technologies. There's a whole series of reputations at play there, which are really important to that particular story. Okay. So within that context, I'm going to outline 3 reputation strategies. Understanding that you don't own your reputation, it's owned by others, but you do own your strategy, your reputation strategy. So what are the 3 levers that you can pull? What are the 3 things which you actually do control, which influence the way in which your reputations are shaped? The first is your behavior. That sounds obvious, but let's just walk through why this is the case. Your behavior sends a signal at every level of different stakeholders about the type of organization you are. The first example here is on governance. GlaxoSmithKline. Does everyone know what GlaxoSmithKline is? Pharmaceutical company. It was Britain's largest company for a while. So a very, very large pharmaceutical company. In 2012, GlaxoSmithKline was fined $550 million for bribing Chinese officials to sell, and doctors to stock and sell their drugs. Okay, $550 million. That was announced, and it was a stock exchange announcement. Tell me something. Do you think the value of GlaxoSmithKline fell by 550 million, more than 550 million, or less than 550 million? Let's start with those who believe in efficient markets, so which I hope is none of you. So who thinks it was 550 million? No one. Good. Who thinks it was more than 550 million? Some of you. Who thinks it was less than 550 million? Some of you. Okay, the answer is it was more. Do you think it was twice? So did $1 billion come off the value? More? Okay, 3 times. 4 times. More? 5 times. 6 times. I'm going to keep going until someone says enough. Enough? 6 times. They lost $8.5 billion of value for a $550 million fine. That was within 4 hours. Why did the market knock $8.5 billion off the value of GlaxoSmithKline for a $550 million fine for bribing Chinese doctors? It recovered after about 4.5 months.
So it knocked it off because everybody assumes pharmaceutical companies behave in that way, and it was clear that there was a lot more.
Right, exactly. First point is if it was happening in China, is that your point?
Yeah.
So it was happening in China, where else? And the largest pharmaceutical market in the world is the US. If it was happening in China, perhaps they were also bribing doctors in the US. That would be a big problem. Okay, that's the first thing. That was the first behavioral signal which was being interpreted by the market. Second thing? Really good. Exactly right. If they were having to bribe doctors to use the product, maybe the product wasn't very good in the first place. Or causing other issues. And so if the drug is actually not very good in the first place, actually, they've got bigger problems all over the world. Excellent. So that's the second behavioral signal. Third signal. Yeah.
Similar to your definition, it's an integrity issue. So it was a governance failure rather than a failure across the broad.
Absolutely spot on. What a good audience you are. That's exactly right. So the third was, this is Britain's largest company. And if they knew about this, then they were incompetent. And if they didn't know about it, then they were incompetent. Okay, so they're stuck between a rock and a hard place as the management team, as the board, on this big question of a failure, a massive failure in governance. So those are three behavioral signals that the market was interpreting from one event. And when you have any behavior, any activity that you take, put yourself in the mind of the people who are interpreting what you have just announced. And think about the signal, the behavioral signal that you send. Anyone watch the Facebook hearings? Yes. Weren't they hilarious? Yes. Okay. So Zuckerberg, the robot himself, he was... anyone who has met him or has interacted with him will know that he has this really, really annoying verbal tic, which is that when you ask him a question, he'll respond normally by saying, "So," and then try and answer it. And what the "so" really means is, okay, you're a bit stupid, and actually I'm going to try and make this as simple as I can to make sure that actually you understand it. And it's incredibly annoying, okay? Now, he was told that. And so very cleverly what he did in these hearings is he replaced that "so," that verbal tic, with a new behavioral signal of the more respectful word senator or congressman or congresswoman. And he used that, and it diffused what would have otherwise been an incredibly irritating behavioral tic. As it turns out, he actually did pretty well in those hearings, but mainly because ultimately the Congress and the Senate were so inept that they didn't know what they were asking. It was almost embarrassing to watch. So that's the behavioral signals bit. Probably the most valuable bit of research that's come out of Oxford, and if there's one thing that you take away from today, and normally people talk about remembering three things, people don't remember three things. People remember one thing, if that. If there's one thing which I hope you take away and remember from today, it's this very, very helpful research-led insight into reputation. It turns out that reputation essentially has two lenses. It has a Janus face. The first is perceptions. Do you remember we talked about expectations and perceptions? The first set of perceptions relate to perceptions of capability. What sort of organization, so what can this organization do? Can it make great products? Can it find oil? Can it distribute? Can it do all of these capability functions? And the second lens is character, which has got nothing to do with what you do, but it's how you go about what you do. What's the type of organization you are? What can I expect of you when I interact with you? This double lens of capability and character, it's an incredibly powerful lens, and it's really valuable. Let me just run through a couple of examples. VW, the Dieselgate emissions scandal, and if you remember United, that example where that poor doctor was dragged off the plane at the airport. That was a United plane. Do you think those crises were capability crises, perceptions of capability, or were they perceptions of character? Character. Yeah, makes sense? Character. By contrast, Toyota, when they had that terrible crash on the freeway south of San Diego in 2009, an off-duty police officer and his family traveling at over 100 miles an hour, the car couldn't slow down, and they crashed at an intersection at 120 miles an hour, killing the entire family. The 911 call they made is still available on the internet. It's a harrowing call to listen to. And Equifax last summer, this is one of the world's largest data companies, and it had a data breach. Capability or character? Capability. So once you've got these in your mind, it starts to become really quite a powerful deductive and analytical tool. And I apologize in advance, because what you'll probably do is start now looking at your colleagues and going, capability? character. And I find myself doing this the whole time. I do it with my kids and my wife, and they get really annoyed, I can tell you, when I start doing this. But it becomes one of these things that once you've got it in your mind, it's a really powerful frame. And it's valuable for some very, very clear reasons. But before I come on to those, the observation has to be made that often these things can be both. You can have a capability and a character aspect. So if you take BP, what do you think BP started as when BP drilled the floor and couldn't? Capability. And very quickly, it morphed into? So, capability and character. And often you see these type of shifts in these sort of crises and perceptions. Boeing, and we'll come on to that, I'm sure, in the crisis. Again, Boeing, capability, character, we can have a discussion about that as well, right? So, why is this valuable? Okay, it turns out there's two really, really valuable insights from your perspective to take away with you. The first is that capability reputations are very sticky. People, well, Warren Buffett was the most famous quote saying it takes 20 years to build a reputation and 20 minutes to lose it. Well, actually, he's wrong. In capability terms, you can hang on to a reputation for really quite a long time. So, if you are an oil company and you drill and you find oil, that's a capability reputation. You've got the ability, you've got the geology, you've got the skills, and you've found oil. If you then don't find oil for the next 2 or 3 drills, do people think that you're unable to find oil? No. It can take quite a long time for perceptions of capability to be destroyed. Maybe if you haven't found oil in 4 years, people go, well, maybe that first one was just lucky. Maybe actually they haven't got the geology, they haven't got any of the skills. But it's very sticky, okay? Character, by contrast, is incredibly volatile. You can be a hero one day, and you can be a zero the next day. And you can go from hero to zero really fast, okay? So that's the first insight, is when you think about these type of issues that you're going to be facing, analyze capability, character, and then you've got a sense of just how fragile the situation is going to be. The second insight, and the second reason why it's valuable, is that it turns out that capability reputations matter to consumers and customers, whereas character reputations matter to counterparties. And by counterparties, I mean suppliers, investors, regulators, employees. Now, why do you think that is? Any ideas? Trust, definitely.
Because for the customers, they have different needs. Customers and the counterparties have different needs.
Completely right. Customers are transactional.
Yes, so they care about that you are capable of providing this service or this good.
Correct. Exactly right. Whereas counterparties, employees, they want to know what type of an organization is this? If I get ill, what can I expect of the organization when I get ill? Or if I've got a problem with childcare and I can't turn up? Or I've got a problem here. What sort of an organization is this? What can I rely on? If suddenly the money gets tight and they have a financial problem, are they going to pay me? Or are they going to try and cut my pay? What type of an organization am I dealing with? So this idea that counterparties care about character and customers care about capability. Now, normally at this point, you get outraged individuals saying, well, no, I'm an ethical consumer, and I care about the type of organization. Now, all of us probably think that we're all ethical consumers. The problem is the data does not support it. The data supports that actually we're incredibly transactional when it comes to things. So when you think about, the final product, as opposed to what?
Some internal capabilities within the organization to execute certain things. For example, we are here as part of our development.
Yes.
Does our trust in the capability of
Capability, and so that's still a capability point, because in this event, you're the customers. But yeah, so you're the customer in this scenario here. And actually, the data shows that we are not very ethical when we actually choose our purchases, no matter what we like to think. So I've looked at a number of examples. The one that I think is perhaps most interesting is the tax debate in the UK when big companies were accused of not paying their taxes. The three big ones were Amazon, Google, and Starbucks. Amazon and Google, they carried on. Starbucks, as customers, we had the ability to go to Costa Coffee or some other coffee, Cafe Nero. It turns out that actually that people who cared about it did so for about 7 days, 6 days maybe. And then we went back to just buying Starbucks again. So we're not actually that ethical when it comes to our purchases. We care about capability. So that's I think, a really important insight, which I hope we might reflect on a bit more over the course of the next few hours as we talk about crisis. If we now apply it through to you, I've had a look at what you have talked about on various of the materials, and you start off with this really interesting and I think very modern approach, which is this point about multi-stakeholders. You're not sitting in a world where you're saying it's all about the shareholder. You're in a world that expressly talks about responsibilities to a broader set of stakeholders, and that puts you right on the right side of history. It's a great starting point. Not every company, by all means, has that as a starting point. You also then have a set of purpose and values that underpin. And what I think is interesting is that as you go through the capability character, look at how it maps. Here are the 4 points that were underpinning how you operate. These are the 4 on your website. So these are the 4 on your website, and they're all capability points. Whereas when you take a look at your values and your values statement, they're all character, which is what you'd hope to see, by the way. So this is here are your value statements. They're all speaking to the character of the organization. But if you take a look back at your capabilities, you're talking about performance, profitability, efficiency, and managing our people and our resource. So, interesting how you can map your particular purpose and value statements onto these very, very valuable frames of capability and character. Also on the point about collaboratives, this new era statement that, again, I was kind of intrigued by when I had a look at what you talk about. You're announcing these new expanded partnership models and a more active approach to managing businesses and portfolios of assets. This is the collaborative economy, which, again, right at the start, we talked about that as being a big theme that organizations around the world are starting to become much more driven towards. You're already embracing that, and it's an incredibly powerful starting point for a distinguishing feature of you within your sector. So, your second influence strategy is that first section was just about your behaviors. The second strategy is networks. Now, the networks bit is important. I'm an economist, for which I apologize. But this is really about sociology, and it's great fun. I wish I'd been reborn as a sociologist. But this is where you get to play with the idea of networks and network concepts. The starting point as to why networks is important is because reputation is constructed through interpersonal relationships, through interacting with others. So the networks are super important, and not all networks are the same. If I'm a Tibetan monk and I sit on my hill in Tibet and I've never met anyone in my life, but I'm the best monk that there's ever been, do I have any reputation? No. I may have the best behavior, but I have no reputation because I have no network. So your behavior, the section we just talked about, is a necessary starting point, but without network, thought, and analysis, it doesn't translate into reputation. So let's think about the different types of networks that surround you. This is a very basic, simple network concept. On the left, you have what is called, in sociology, an open network. Robert has two friends, the two black dots. Jessica has likewise two friends, the two black dots. And Robert and Jessica know each other a little bit. There's a dotted line between them. So they may be colleagues in an office. They may meet each other at the water cooler, but their friends don't know each other. They don't socialize outside of work. So that is what's called, in sociology, an open network. A closed network, by contrast, on the right, where Robert and Jessica have a very big line between them, a thick line, that is a tight network and a closed network where Robert knows Jessica very well, and more importantly, Jessica's friends, those two dots, know Robert's friends, and vice versa. So a closed network, everyone knows everyone, and an open network on the left, more separate. Give me an example of a closed network where everyone knows everyone. Military. Military is actually quite a good example, but probably not that closed, because maybe their families don't socialize with each other, maybe, but yeah, I mean, it's a pretty good closed network. Any other examples? PR in the UAE. Maybe you want more closure on that one, but let's carry on. Yep. Any other examples? A club, marriage. Yeah, so a family. So a family is probably the best example, of course, because by definition, everyone knows everyone. Now, without going into all of your families, does information move fast or slow in a family closed network? It depends on your family, of course, and we don't want to go into people's families, but I think this gentleman here was absolutely right. It moves super fast, okay? Super fast. So closed networks, information, firstly, moves super fast. Secondly, does it move with great certainty or not? Great certainty. Why?
Because they know each other, so there's a lot of trust.
There's a lot of trust, and the reputational cost of misbehaving or lying is very high.
Yeah, because there is the line is
Very, very tight, exactly. So if we are brother and sister, and I lie to you, and this is my extended family, my goodness, then it's a very risky strategy, because if I lie to you, suddenly everyone else in my extended family knows that I'm lying. Okay, so that's a great observation. What we're talking about is dynamic network formation, right? You can choose to create closure in a network, or you can choose to open a network up. Which do you think is better? More closure or more open? It depends. It depends. It depends on what? It depends on what you're trying to achieve. Exactly right. There's no such thing as good or bad. It's just different types of networks. So in a closed network where information moves super fast and with high certainty, okay, they are valuable in what sense? What's valuable about that? When is a closed network really valuable like that? And deal-making. And so decision-making and deal-making in particular. Deal-making because if I'm doing an acquisition or if I'm entering into a strategic partnership and I've got then I'm in a closed network. All I've got to do is ask one person, should I trust this person? If I get the right answer, we're done. Because the ties are so strong, so my due diligence costs are minimal. Okay, it's really powerful. But when is it a bad idea to have closed networks?
based on what you're dealing with.
So within your team, that would still be okay, though, right? Because you've got that. But not as a company, yeah. Because that's probably true. Right. So closed networks tend to be sort of in groups. They form in groups, don't they? Yep. With correct. Closed networks do not promote innovation. Why? Information moves super fast. What happens is that I tell you something, and you think this is really interesting, so you tell, so it passes around. You then tell me, I think, well, that's super smart, because you've just told me what I've told you. So suddenly we're all ignorantly certain.
And when we are in that close circle, we tend to be thinking the same way.
Correct. Correct.
And there is no, we would be close-minded.
Correct. So innovation is normally the problem in closed networks. New ideas don't come in. Open networks are much better for new ideas. They have got time to germinate. They've got time to be allowed to circulate, be considered, rather than rejected immediately because it's just a different voice in this super fast closed network. Okay? So open networks are good for innovation. Closed networks are great for efficiency. So if you're thinking, how do I improve efficiency of my teams? Start to build some closure. Give me some examples of what you do to close a network. A few techniques. How would you close a network?
Maybe a day out.
A day out. Team buildings, exactly. Team buildings, day outs, team dinners, all of that stuff, yeah? Perfect. And how would you open a network? How would you do more open?
You do cross-posting, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, so bring in, yep, slow things down. Don't have deadlines of tomorrow. So go and think about things for a week. Have longer term projects. Involve different voices. Bring in different names, different people. Okay. So this idea of networks, super important to think about the type of network that's going to be valuable for the type of reputation activity that you want. Some reputation activities, you're going to want closure. Other reputation activities, you're going to want a more open network. And there are things you can do to create that information flow. Now, other things on networks. First of all, there's reputation by association. Whether you like it or not, you are associated with the Middle East. Whether you like it or not. Simple as that. You're in that network and you're there to stay. But you're also able to choose other associations. So think very carefully. This is who do you want to be known to be in the company of. So, for example, if you think about what Saudi Aramco is trying to do, it's having a network play by trying to list on either New York Stock Exchange or the London Stock Exchange. Why are they doing that? To be associated with the reputation for best governance. Yeah, they don't need the money. They want the image. They want the reputation. They don't need the money. So this is reputation by association in the network. It's why also you'll think about appointing people to your board. Okay? These are big names, okay? Powerful people. And those are signals, right? They're signals that you're well connected. Okay? That the political risk is less than it otherwise could be. You know, these are all very interesting reputation plays. Bernie Madoff, who I interviewed for my book, this is him in the picture. He's in jail in Butner, North Carolina, until 2148. Anyway, I interviewed him for my book, and it was interesting, actually. Just a little story aside. When you communicate with someone in federal prison in the U.S., you have to go through something called the Correctional Links email system. And the Correctional Links email system is basically a closed email system for inmates. So I contacted him, and to my great surprise, he came back and said, yes, I'd be happy to talk to you for your book. So I said, that's great. How do we proceed? He said, well, first of all, could you give me some money? I said, sure, but why? He said, well, because we have to pay as inmates. We have to pay for internet time. I said, well, okay, fair enough. That's all right. So I said, How much? And he said, $200. I thought, well, we'll be doing a lot of internet time, which is great, but that's fine. So I sent him off $200. I said, where would you like me to send $200 to? And he gave me a P.O. box, a post office box, in Idaho. I thought, Butner is in North Carolina, and my American geography is not great, but Idaho is a long way from North Carolina. So how's it going to get from Idaho into North Carolina? So I sent the money off, and I then contacted him. I said, did you get the money? He went, oh, I'm really sorry, I've given you the wrong address. He said, would you mind just sending another $200? So at this point, I thought, this is interesting. I sent another $200 to another P.O. box somewhere else. And I then said, did you get it? And he went, no, I'm so sorry, I've given you the wrong address again. Would you mind sending another $200? So I rang up my editor and said, I think we've got a name for the book here. And it was going to be called The Prison Ponzi. Because I thought this was a brand new Ponzi scheme that he was running from prison. Sadly, it got to $800 or $600, and the money eventually got to him. So it wasn't quite as much of a Ponzi scheme as I thought. But anyway, Madoff, as it turns out, was a brilliant player of the network game. He is someone who created this illusion about just how impossible it was to get into his network of funds. He created this sort of incredibly brilliant story about how the funds were closed, you couldn't get in, he wouldn't take your money. It was a brilliant network play. Whatever you think of Madoff, he was an incredible network player. The other thing around networks is this idea of different situational congruence or incongruence. Okay? If you think about you and the network that you operate in and are surrounded by here in the UAE, you're a national champion. Okay, you really are a national champion. Your employees are highly connected. There's a very high degree of social media activity. There's a lot of closure in your networks. Okay, a lot of closure. Lots of people have lots of very tight ties in your networks. This idea that actually what you're doing is a shared national right. The oil is everyone's, and it's everyone's inheritance, it's everyone's future. Everyone feels like they've got a stake in this company, whether they work for you or not. So that whole network closure is really powerful here, okay? And it's a high motivation environment within a closed network. If you go outside and think about your location on that brand list of number 9, where you were number 9, against these other players, you're a very different beast. You're seen in very different ways to what you're seen as here. In the international world, the first thing is that you're an oil and gas company. An oil company is not a good thing to be in the international world. You're a dirty polluter, and you're on the wrong side of the environment movement. Okay? That's the first set of associations. The second set of associations is that, relative to the other global energy companies, you're a sort of fairly sort of boring, middle of the road, sort of middle ranking, undistinctive company. Okay? In this open network that exists outside, you're a very small player, relatively to the others. And so this is, again, this congruence or incongruence, which happens when you think about your network position relative to the context. Technology has increased network closure, okay? Because we're now much more connected to many, many more people. Your network size is bigger, which might mean you might think that actually you're making more open networks. But what you're doing is you've got larger networks which are much more tightly connected. I have 2,500 LinkedIn followers. I don't know 99% of them, okay? But they're all linked to me and I can communicate with them instantly. So I'm much more tightly connected. And I thought I'd show you this video, which was the first video to go to 1 million hits, the first campaigning video to go to 1 million hits within 1 hour. And this was Greenpeace, who were trying to draw attention to the plight of the orangutan in Malaysia. And it was a campaign which they had been, for 6 or 7 years, they've been trying to draw attention to the plight of the orangutan. And they really hadn't got very far. And then they produced this particular video. Pretty gruesome. What KitKat did is they chose to use technology in a closed network, and it was incredibly powerful. This went to the Nestle board, and the Nestle board then decided to sign up to the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, and in 6 months had changed their supply chain, all because of one video. That video, anyone think how much that cost? £890 it cost. £890. And that was the most powerful campaigning video that Kumi Naidu and Greenpeace have ever issued. Now, this is the type of world that, of course, is the world in which you're all operating now. This campaigning world where people are going to use technology to either close the networks or open up the networks for their advantage, not for yours. And so think very carefully about some of the campaigning that's going to go on around you. So that's networks. The final one I'm going to leave you with, just in the last 10 minutes or so, the final section is around narratives. Now, you might think you're on top of all of that, and you probably are, because you're pretty expert narrative developers. But I'm going to give you just some thoughts to think about, because the world of narratives is changing, and it's changing in some pretty fundamental ways, especially for corporates. I'm going to start with this. How many of you have seen this or know the story of the Fire Festival? Okay, so I'm just going to show you this video. This was the promotional video for this incredible party that was going to be happening 2 years ago now.
The actual experience exceeds all expectations and is something that's hard to put into words. All these things that may seem big and impossible are not. It gives people that type of energy, that type of power.
Who wants to go to that? Most of us, right? It's, I mean, it's a sort of, this was an incredibly persuasive video. It prompted a massive ticket rush. and they sold out within hours of this coming out. But what do you notice about the narrative here? So on that video, you had some really, really clever, simple, powerful, connective narratives. On a private island in the Exumas, on an island once owned by Pablo Escobar, right? Those choices of words, really, really clever and really powerful. The exclusivity. And also perhaps a little bit of illicit fun, the whole idea of Pablo Escobar, that held the promise of perhaps just, a really hedonistic weekend. The reality of it, of course, was completely different. This was the deserted island formerly owned by Pablo Escobar. Actually, they weren't allowed to say this. The contract where they'd got the ability to use that strip of land expressly forbade them using that particular phrase. He was trying to move away, the owner of the land, from the Pablo Escobar time. And so they cancelled the contract, and from there, everything fell apart. And the story became, legendary. It's a Netflix documentary, and the documentary Fire Fraud came out as well. Worth a look if you're interested in just how powerful narrative frames can be in achieving the almost impossible. But what lies behind this is actually, I think, sort of probably more interesting. And that's that narratives, there's some big themes underpinning why narratives are changing now. First of all, the self-publishing revolution. This world of narrative strategies has become incredibly sophisticated. You're now in much more control of what you say about yourselves, rather than having to rely on the third parties of news and other websites, etc. You can publish so much more than you ever were able to before. The democratization of everything. You can now challenge and have narrative strategies around that. The context collapse. You can't now say one set of messages to employees and have another set of messages for investors. That world, if it ever existed, is now gone. And that's tricky to navigate from a narrative perspective. And it's produced a number of these great, emblematic narrative collapses. This is Tony Hayward up on the right. "I want my life back" has become the defining quote for the former chief executive of BP. And down at the bottom there is Harvey Weinstein, who is the disgraced Hollywood mogul, who famously said, when he was asked a question about what had gone wrong, he said, "Look, I'm actually the good guy here." And that came back to haunt him in so many different ways. So the power of narratives has taken on a particularly emotive quality today. I don't often find myself sort of backing this orange-haired gentleman here, but he is a master of narrative simplicity. When you think about the campaign that he ran, can anyone here remember, by the way, any of Jeb Bush's campaign slogans? No. Anything? Not even one? Me neither. But all of us remember "Make America Great Again," "Crooked Hillary." There's "Build the Wall," brilliant "Drain the Swamp," brilliant, simple narratives. And that idea of narrative simplicity is where I think the world has dramatically changed. If you go onto your website and start looking at the length of your sentences, they're long. They're complex. Your paragraphs have just, you kind of lose the will to live half the time, okay? Because the message gets lost. It's too complicated. And the world in which corporate narratives has grown up, corporate narratives forever have been about detail and, sort of precise, and move to different bits and breakouts. That world is gone. The world now is a world where you've got to find ways to simplify, dramatically simplify, in order to break through. Because in a world where there's so much information at your fingertips, the real power lies in the breakthrough. How do you break through? And it's capturing people's attention. So attention is the new currency of the modern information game, not language. So narrative simplicity and capturing attention. Now, it turns out that there's effectively 7 global stories which have underpinned literature, film, and culture for very, very many years. There's 7 frames on which almost everything that we've read or we talk about children's stories, main stories, are based around. And it's interesting because you can start to look at which organizations are anchoring themselves in the particular narrative frame. So I'm going to walk you through the 7 and finish on that and ask you the question, which is ADNOC's frame? Which is the narrative frame which the new narrative for this business is going to be anchored in? I've got some views, but I think it's a really useful exercise for you to have a think about where you sit. The first frame is this overcoming the monster. Stories like Jaws, obviously, huge, big overcoming the monster story. The corporate equivalent of that, Airbnb, for example. Airbnb, the monster, who's the monster in the hotel business? Or Hilton, Starwood, all these old hotels. Okay? They're saying that's the monster. It's a dreadful business. You're having to pay for all that overhead. Don't do any of that. Choose where you want to go, in what way you want to do it. Do it through us. Airbnb is now worth more than Hilton and Starwood. Its market capitalization is about 30 billion, and it owns not a single hotel room. Not one. In terms of a reputation business, it's achieved an enormous amount. So that's overcoming the monster. Rags to riches. Second frame. Obviously Cinderella, one of the best stories. Facebook, in its early guises, was the whole story narrative was around the guys in their dorm, the Harvard dorm, making this incredible technology, and becoming, this American dream. Okay, suddenly they were the great American college entrepreneurs, rags to riches. Different story now. Interesting to think where Facebook would be today, but that was their dominant narrative for many years. The quest, right? This is obviously Lord of the Rings, many other stories. In corporate terms, I think Ant Financial are there. I mean, this is an organization, I went to visit them in China. I mean, they are an absolutely phenomenal organization. They are trying to change our entire relationship with finance. It's a quest. It's a quest to change, fundamentally change the way we think about our wealth and our income and how we interact with that. The fourth, voyage and return. This is Alice in Wonderland, the story. In corporate terms, I think quite a lot of the banks. The banks have been on this incredible voyage, and now they're trying to get back to where they were pre-crisis. But there's probably others, but I think the banks are quite a useful point for that. Comedy. Quite an interesting area, this one. And very interesting to think of corporate narratives based on comedy. But there's some really good examples of organizations that do this really well. The one I particularly like is Dollar Shave Club. If any of you have seen their adverts, they are hilarious, properly engaging and funny. And the really interesting thing when you talk to them and their management team is that they get research scientists from some of the best research institutes who come and work for them because these scientists think it's going to be a fun place to be. Interesting.
When these social media accounts, it's hilarious.
So Wendy's may well be in this category. Tragedy. Now, no one actively sets out to be in this frame, obviously, and you kind of don't want to be there for too long. But IBM, I think probably were there for a while, may actually be coming out now. Interesting as to where they're trying to position themselves. And the final one is rebirth. This is obviously Christmas Carol, but I think the best rebirth, the best corporate rebirth story, gotta be Apple. Phenomenal. All of their narrative is about, look at what we've done to revitalize change. So I'm going to leave you with that question. What is your story frame? It's going to sit somewhere in there. Could be rebirth, rags to riches, overcoming the monster. I'll tell you where I think it is, but then what the hell do I know? All I know is that I've had a look, and I see you as the Quest. I see you as a Quest type of organization. But it's worth having a debate. And I'm going to leave you with that because my time is up. Thank you very much.